Welcome back. We took a break and this is part 2. Okay, it still goes into great detail about this guy, that guy, and all this other stuff in between. But it states here, you can go on to talk blithely about what the first Jewish Christians thought in Jerusalem, and no one would guess that your only real evidence, if you can call it such, is the New Testament, that body of much worked over traditions, whose evidence would not stand for 2 minutes in a court of law. As for Jesus as the Son of God and Messiah, he doesn't dispute it for a moment, but they now know from Qumran that their own Davidic Messiah was reckoned a Son of God, begotten of God. But that doesn't prove the church's fantastic claim for Jesus that he was God himself. There's no contrast in their terminology at all. The contrast is in its interpretation. And these authors state that they had proof of both the deliberate delays and the value of the unpublished Qumran scrolls. The text to which Allegro is alluding, which speaks of the Son of God, has still not been published, despite its importance and despite its early identification and translation. Only in 1990 were excerpts from it to be leaked to BAR. Okay, here, Allegro's honour and generosity, however, were not to be rewarded or even recognised. The film, complete to the end of 1957, it says some sort of film was made, documentary, was not transmitted by the BBC until the summer of 1959, and then only in the late night slot, which attracted a minimal audience. By that time, well, they probably planned it like that, so there wouldn't be anyone awake to see it, right? Very few that would be watching it. By that time, understandably enough, Allegro was beginning to grow uneasy. On 10th January 1959, after the latest in a long series of postponements, he wrote to Uni Dajani, "Well, I've done it again. For the fifth time, the BBC have put off showing that TV program on the scrolls. There can be no reasonable doubt now that de Vaux's cronies in London are using their influence to kill the program, as he wished. De Vaux will stop at nothing to control the scroll's material. Somehow or other, he must be removed from his present controlling position." And this guy Allegro was convinced that if something does turn up which affects the Roman Catholic dogma, the world will never see it. De Vaux will scrape the money out of some or other barrel and send the lot to the Vatican to be hidden or destroyed. After repeating what he'd come increasingly to see as a viable short-term solution, nationalisation of the Rockefeller Museum, the scrollery and the scrolls by the Jordanian government, he reveals a sense of punctilio to which he previously felt subject. He states that he might even let out an instance or two when information has been suppressed, but he'll only do that if De Vaux looks like winning. What's this? Only 4 years before Pope John XXIII had officially and doctrinally exculpated the Jews of any responsibility for Jesus' death, and he excised all vestiges of anti-Semitism from Roman Catholic canon law, no one wished to see this sort of conciliatory work undone. Because in 1961, King Hussein appointed Allegro honorary advisor on the scrolls to the government of Jordan. The post, however, though prestigious enough, entailed no real authority. It was not until November 1966, 5 years later, that the Jordanian government finally acted on Allegro's suggestion and nationalised the Rockefeller Museum. By then, as his authors had seen it, it was too late. Within a year, the 6-day war was to erupt in a museum. The scrollery and its contents all passed into Israeli hands, and Israel, as they have noted, was too much in need of international support to risk a head-on confrontation with the Vatican and the Catholic hierarchy, because only 4 years before, Pope John XXIII had officially and doctrinally exculpated the Jews of any responsibility for Jesus' death and excised all vestiges of anti-Semitism from Roman Catholic canon law. So that's probably what they had within the Roman Catholic canon law, or this anti-Semitism, right? Perhaps. Okay, it's a mention of a book, Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. What turned the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross into a scandal were Allegro's conclusions about Jesus. In attempting to establish the source of all religious belief, in practice Allegro asserted that Jesus had never existed in historical reality, was merely an image evoked in the psyche under the influence of a hallucinatory drug, psilocybin, the active ingredient in hallucinogenic mushrooms. In effect, he argued Christianity, like all other religions, stemmed from a species of psychedelic experience, a ritualistic rite de passage promulgated by an orgiastic magic mushroom cult. Yeah, heard about that. Sorry about the temple priests, maybe Russian Orthodox, wore those mushroom hats. Because to drop these mushrooms, supposedly the temple Jews used weed. Yeah, they had like resin found in the bottom of the jugs that they used, the vases, etc. A lot of the English, maybe Scottish stained glass windows, they've got depictions of magic mushrooms, yeah, on the base of their windows and all this sort of stuff. They reckon Santa Claus was invented because the deer apparently munched on these psychedelic mushrooms and they acted weird, so the people tried it out and they started seeing flying reindeers, all this sort of stuff. And that's where the images of Christmas scenery with red and white toadstools and mushrooms and all this other stuff originates from, apparently. A lot of these mystery cults, etc., these religions use all these different kind of hallucinogenic mushrooms and stuff. It is certainly not inconceivable that such substances were known to and perhaps employed by first century Judaism and early Christianity. One must also remember the climate and atmosphere of the late 1960s. Allegro continued to bring the attention of the public to the delays in the publication of the scrolls. In 1987, the year before his death, he declared the international team's delays to be pathetic and inexcusable, and added that his former colleagues for years have been sitting on the material which is not only of outstanding importance, but also quite the most religious sensitive. There is no doubt that the evidence from the scrolls undermines the uniqueness of the Christians as a sect. In fact, we know damn all about the origins of Christianity. However, these documents do lift the curtain, but they are suppressing them, sitting on them, right? We're releasing them, especially to the public, because someone had a stranglehold on it, a monopoly over it, on it. By this time, the initiative had passed into the hands of the next generation of scholars, and Allegro had left the world of scholarship to pursue his research on the origins of myth and religion. His work subsequent to the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross were moderate enough, but for most readers, as well as for the academic establishment, he was to remain in exile. The man who, in the sneering words of the times, had traced the source of Christianity to an edible fungus. He died suddenly in 1988, no longer accepted by his colleagues, but still energetic, enthusiastic about his own philological work and progress, and optimistic. It must have been some consolation for him to see before his death that his defiance of the international team and his concern about their delays in releasing material were already being echoed by others. Wilson, merely a question. Who's this guy Wilson? Go back a bit. Edmund Wilson. Merely a question of tension and inhibition. It had now begun to assume that the proportions of a cover-up and a scandal. He had been told by a Catholic scholar that at first, in regard to the scrolls, a kind of official policy tended to bias scholarship in the direction of minimising their importance. By the mid-1970s, biblical scholars were beginning to speak openly of a scandal. Even the most docile began to have their worries, and the international team were alienating men who had no desire to engage in academic controversy. Among the most prominent names in contemporary Semitic scholarship, for example, is that of Dr. Giza Vermes, who has, since 1951, been publishing books and articles on the scrolls. Initially, he had no quarrel with the international team and their work. Like many others, however, he gradually began to lose patience with the delays in publication. In 1977, he published a book, The Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran in Perspective, in the first chapter of which he publicly flung down the gauntlet. On this 13th anniversary of their first coming to light, the world is entitled to ask the authorities responsible for the publication of the Qumran scrolls what they intend to do about this lamentable state of affairs. For unless drastic measures are taken at once, the greatest and the most valuable of all Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts discoveries is likely to become the academic scandal par excellence of the 20th century. True to form, the international team did not deign to take any notice. Nearly a decade later, in 1985, Dr. Vermes again called them to account, this time in the Times literary supplement. They still didn't do anything. In the work of the 2nd century Christian writer Justin Martyr, Puig found another quotation deriving directly from the Qumran scrolls. "We are not hiding anything," Puig insisted adamantly. "We will publish everything." To our knowledge, however, none of the revelations confided by Puig in conversation has yet appeared in print, and there seems no immediate likelihood of their doing so. On the other hand, there has been a recent leak which offers some indication of the kind of material still being suppressed. This leak surfaced in 1990 in the pages of Bar and was confided apparently by an unnamed scholar whose conscience was troubling him. It consists of a Qumran fragment very similar to a passage in Luke's Gospel referring to Jesus' imminent birth, Luke 1:32-5 speaks of a child who will be called Son of the Most High and Son of God. The Qumran fragment from K4 also speaks of the coming of someone who by his name shall be hailed as the Son of God, and they shall call him Son of the Most High. This, as BAR points out, is an extraordinary discovery, the first time that the term Son of God has been found in a Palestinian text outside the Bible. Whatever the circumstances pertaining to the release of this fragment, it derives from the corpus of material, or the body of material, hitherto controlled and rigorously withheld by the elusive Father Milik. You see, he's one of those Roman Catholics that was sent there to check it out and let the Vatican know, Roman Catholic Vatican know, because they were afraid if it gets released to the public, it might have a different story and they'll be totally ruined. People will realise they've been lying to us. Opposing the consensus, Edmund Wilson, John Allegro and Giza Vermes all condemned the international team for secrecy, for procrastination and delay in releasing Qumran material, and for establishing a scholarly monopoly or stranglehold over the Dead Sea Scrolls. Wilson and Allegro both challenged the team's laboured attempts to distance the Qumran community from the so-called early Christianity. In other respects, however, all three scholars concurred with the consensus of interpretation established by the international team. They accepted, for example, the team's dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls as being pre-Christian. They also accepted the team's contention that the members of the Qumran community were Essenes, and they accepted that the supposed Essenes at Qumran were of the traditional kind described by Pliny, Philo and Josephus: ascetic, reclusive, pacifist, divorced from the mainstream of social, political and religious thought. If Christianity were indeed somehow connected with this Qumran community, it therefore emerged as less original than had hitherto been believed. It could be seen to have drawn on Qumran, just as it was acknowledged to have drawn on conventional Old Testament Judaism. Apart from that, there was no particular reason to modify one's image or conception of it. By the 1960s, however, scholarly opposition to the international team's consensus had begun to arise from another quarter. This questioning of that consensus was to be much more radical than anything submitted by Wilson, Allegro or Vermes. It was to challenge not only the dating of the Qumran scrolls as established by the international team, but also the allegedly Essene character of the Qumran community. The men responsible for this criticism were Cecil Roth and Godfrey Driver. Cecil Roth was perhaps the most prominent Jewish historian of his era. After serving with the British Army during the First World War, he had obtained his doctorate from Merton College, Oxford, as a historian. Okay, goes further into him. Cecil Roth. Wonder if he was the father of Andrew Gabriel Roth, the translator of the Aramaic Scriptures.com. Could be a relation to him. Being Jewish. Yeah, it probably is. In the meantime, Cecil Roth had been conducting his own research and in 1958 published the results in a work entitled The Historical Background of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The historical background, he argued, was not pre-Christian, but on the contrary, dated from the time of the revolt in Judea between AD 66 and 74. Like Driver, Roth insisted that the texts of the scrolls themselves were a more accurate guide than archaeology or paleography. Availing himself of this guide, he developed a number of points that not only ran counter to the international team's consensus, but must have also outraged the Catholics among them. Citing textual references in one of the scrolls, for instance, he demonstrated that the invaders regarded as adversaries by the Qumran community could only be Romans, and further could only be Romans of the Empire, of imperial rather than republican times. He also demonstrated that the militant nationalism and messianic fervour in many of the scrolls had less in common with traditional images of the Essenes than with the zealots ascribed by Josephus. He acknowledged that the original community at Qumran might indeed have been established by Essenes of the traditional kind, but if so, he contended they would have vacated the site when it was destroyed in 37 BC. Those who occupied it subsequently after 4 BC and who deposited the scrolls would not have been Essenes at all, but the zealots. Pursuing his argument a step further, he then endeavoured to establish links between the Qumran community and the fierce defenders of Masada, 30 miles to the south. Such assertions, needless to say, provoked indignant criticism from Father de Vaux' team. One of de Vaux' associates, Jean Carmenac, in reviewing Roth's book, complained that Roth does not miss any occasion to closely link Masada and Qumran, but this is another weakness of his thesis. So this guy was in his face. Some guy here in 85, well-known Israeli MP Yuval Ne'eman, began to take an interest in the matter, and in the process showed himself to be surprisingly well briefed. Ne'eman was a world-famous physicist, professor of physics, etc., etc., a military planner. He raised the issue of the scrolls in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, declaring it a scandal that the Israeli authorities had not reviewed or updated the situation, that the international team had been left with a mandate and monopoly dating from the former Jordanian regime. It was this challenge that finally forced the Israeli Department of Antiquities to investigate how and why an enclave of Catholic-oriented scholars should exercise so complete and exclusive a control over what was in fact an Israeli state treasure. So that's the beginnings of somebody doing something about their monopoly. The Department of Antiquities proceeded to confront the international team on the question of publication. What accounted for the procrastination and delays, and what kind of timetable for publication could reasonably be expected? The director of the team at the time was Father Benoit, who on 15 September 1985 wrote to his colleagues. In this letter, a copy of which is in the author's possession, he reminded them of Morton Smith's call for immediate publication of photographs. He also complained, as if he were the aggrieved party, about the use of the word scandal, or upset party, not just by Morton Smith but by Ne'eman as well in the Knesset. He went on to state his intention of recommending John Strignall as chief editor of future publications, and he requested a timetable for publication for each member of the team. Compliance with Father Benoit's request was dilatory and patchy. The Department of Antiquities, prodded by Ne'eman, wrote to him again on December 26, 1985, repeating its request for a report and for answers to the questions it had raised. One cannot be sure whether Benoit based his reply on reliable information received from his colleagues, or whether he was simply improvising in order to busy time or to buy time. But he wrote to the Department of Antiquities promising definitely that everything in the international team's possession would be published within 7 years, that is by 1993. This timetable was submitted in writing as a binding undertaking, but of course no one took it seriously. And in personal conversation with the authors, Ne'eman stated he had heard on the grapevine that the timetable was generally regarded as a joke. It has certainly proved to be so. There was no prospect whatever of all the Qumran material, or even a reasonable part of it, appearing by 1993. Not even the whole of the material from Cave 4 has been published following Allegre's volume for discoveries in the Judaism desert back in 1968. Only 3 more have been issued in 1972, 1982, 1990, bringing the total number of volumes to 8. Yes, there was a scare running through the team, the international team, because of pressure, right? It started panic among them, and then looking for someone to blame, and trying to find out who brought the Israeli government into the affair. Start demanding of them. Who was it? So the team had concluded Giza Vermes to have been responsible. In fact, Vermes had nothing whatever to do with the matter. It was Robert Eisenman who had briefed Nehemiah. And it goes on about this guy, Eisenman. The international team's stranglehold, he realised, could not be broken solely through decorous or even strident protest in learned journals. It would be necessary to bring external pressure to bear, preferably from above. Accordingly, Eisenman met and briefed Professor Nehemiah, and Nehemiah then forced the issue on the Knesset. Later that year, Eisenman himself approached Father Benoit and verbally requested access to the scrolls. Predictably enough, Benoit politely refused, adroitly suggesting that Eisenman should ask the Israeli authorities, and implying that the decision was not his to make. At this point, Eisenman was still unaware of the stratagems employed by the international team to thwart all applications who wanted access to the scrolls. He was not, however, prepared to be excluded so easily. Yeah, they continually try to suppress it, this international team, making excuses, making promises, and yet not following up with them. Eichmann goes through a lot of processes. Eichmann responded to Stroganow's brush-off by going as public as he possibly could. By the middle of 1989, the issue had become a cause celebrate. Is that like a cause to celebrate? In American and Israeli newspapers. Or celebrity cause, and to a lesser degree was picked up by the British press as well. Eisenman was extensively and repeatedly quoted by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, Time magazine, and Canada's Maclean's magazine. He stressed 5 major points. 1, that all research on the Dead Sea Scrolls was being unfairly monopolised by a small enclave of scholars with vested interests and a biased orientation. 2, that only a small percentage of the Qumran material was finding its way into print, and that most of it was still being withheld. 3, that it was misleading to claim that the bulk of the so-called biblical texts had been released, because the most important material consisted of the so-called sectarian texts, new texts never seen before, with a great bearing on the history and religious life of the first century. These were events outside of the Bible. Consisting of the secondary text. 4, that after 40 years access to the scrolls should be made available to all interested scholars. 5, that AMS carbon 14 tests monitored by independent laboratories and researchers should immediately be conducted on the Qumran documents. As was perhaps inevitable once the media had begun to sensationalise it, the affair quickly degenerated, with Eisenman being misquoted on 2 separate occasions and a barrage of invective coming from both sides. But behind the clash of egos, the central issue remained unresolved. As Philip Davies had written in 1988, any archaeologist or scholar who digs or finds a text but does not pass on what has been found deserves to be locked up as an enemy of science. After 40 years we have neither a full and definitive report on a dig nor a full publication of these scrolls. They're still trying to suppress it. Academic politics and bureaucratic inertia. Here it looks like it's still struggling. They try to keep campaigning to obtain open access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah. When in 1985 there was published a long and hard-hitting article on the delays in releasing Qumran material, and when Eisenman obtained a copy of the computer printout listing all the fragments in the international team's possession, he leaked this document to BAR. He thus furnished Barr with invaluable ammunition. In return, Barr was only too eager to provide publicity and an open forum. As the authors have also noted, however, Barr's attack, at least in part, was directed at the Israeli government, whom it had held as responsible for the delays as the international team themselves. So they were doing it as well. Eisenman was careful to distance himself from Barr's position in this respect. To attack the Israeli government, he felt, was simply to divert attention from the real problem, the withholding of information. And his father Benoit still involved in it. Some sort of committee. Oops. Looking for when they finally got the findings released, but here it says the Vatican's representatives, the Council of Science. Until now, this book has referred to the villains of the piece as the international team. In the conversations with them, however, Robert Eisenman and others would often allude to the École Biblique, the French Dominican archaeological school in Jerusalem. Indeed, the international team and the École Biblique were frequently used interchangeably, and Legray, too, in his letters, will refer to the international team as the École Biblique gang. So they're part and parcel. They're doing the same thing as them doing it together. As these authors have noted, the international team, from its very beginnings, was dominated by Father de Vaux, then director of the École Biblique, and by his close friend and disciple, the then Father Millet. As Allegro complained, both men would constantly arrogate first claim to all incoming texts. All fragments are brought first to de Vaux or Millet, and complete secrecy is kept over what they till long after they have been studied by this group. Even Strugnell stated that when fresh material came in, Millet would invariably pounce on it, claiming it fell within the parameters of his own particular assignment. Not surprisingly then, Millet ended up with the lion's share of the most important material, and particularly of the controversial sectarian material. The creation of his monopoly was facilitated by the fact that he was permanently resident in Jerusalem at the time, along with two of his staunchest supporters, de Vaux and Father Jean Starkey. Father Skehan, though not permanently resident in Jerusalem, threw his weight behind this triumvirate. So did Professor Cross, who had been assigned biblical rather than sectarian material anyway. Allegro, of course, cast himself in the role of rebel, but his opposition was hampered by the fact that he was in Jerusalem only intermittently. They were there permanently, right? So they were still controlling it, still had monopoly over it. They wouldn't release it. These two teams working together to suppress it. The release of these Dead Sea Scroll texts. Yeah, still quite a lot of information there. The scroll fragments. What's it got here? Manzoni. In 1896, Fogazzaro had become a senator. He was also regarded as the leading Catholic layman of his day, and by his contemporaries at least as the greatest novelist Italy had produced since Manzoni. In The Saint, published in 1905, Fogazzaro wrote, "The Catholic Church, calling itself the fountain of truth, today opposes the search after truth, when the foundations, the sacred books, the formulae of her dogmas, her alleged infallibility become objects of research. To us, this signifies that she no longer has faith in herself." They had the monopoly. Right up until this point, they still had the monopoly. matter who came along by the looks of it. Things didn't happen, so things didn't get published. These Roman Catholics, etc., etc., these two teams continue to have this monopoly of these Dead Sea Scrolls, these Qumran texts. Okay, the scrolls eventually passed in Israeli hands, and as these authors have noted, this attitude shared by the former Father Millock, neither he nor another of his colleagues, the late Father Starkey, ever returned to Jerusalem after the 1967 war, when the scrolls passed into Israeli hands. Then again, of course, their position only echoes that of the Vatican itself, which even today does not recognize the state of Israel. But one is prompted to ask whether their prejudice simply coincided with the official church policy, or whether it was formally dictated by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Inquisition today. Given its obligatory allegiance to the congregation, one is justified in wondering whether, quite simply, the École Biblique can be trusted, or could be trusted, even if the Israeli government clamped down and ordered the immediate release of all Qumran material. How could these authors be sure, or these writers be sure, that items potentially compromising to the church would ever see the light of day? They personally, in this book, would have liked to pose publicly certain basic questions to Father Jean-Luc Vesco, the École Biblique's current director. If the École Biblique is accountable for the Pontifical Biblical Commission and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, what are its responsibilities to scholarship? How can any reputable academic institution function under the strain of such potentially divided, even mutually hostile loyalties? And what exactly would the École Biblique do if, among the unpublished or perhaps as yet undiscovered Qumran material, something inimical to church doctrine turned up? Yeah, something that, would like expose them. What would they do? Show you the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, it's quite an interesting book. We're up to page 131, and these people are still writing that these people trying to get the Dead Sea Scroll materials released were having such a hard time. Okay, look here. The church had no opportunity to establish control over the text found at Nag Hammadi, and venal motives notwithstanding, the entire corpus, or the whole body of Nag Hammadi material, found its way quickly into print in the public domain. The church's high level involvement in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship must inevitably foster a grave element of suspicion. Can one ignore the possibility of a causal connection between that involvement and the shambles that Qumran research has become? One is compelled to ask, as indeed many informed outsiders have, whether some other vested interest may be at stake, a vested interest larger than the reputation of individual scholars. The vested interest of Christianity as a whole, for example, and of Christian doctrine, at least as propounded by the Church and its tradition. Ever since the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, one single or pervasive question has haunted the imagination, generating excitement, anxiety, and perhaps dread. Might these texts issuing from so close to the source, and unlike the New Testament never having been edited or tampered with, shed some significant new light on the origins of Christianity, on the so-called early church in Jerusalem, and perhaps on Jesus himself? Might they contain something compromising, something that challenges, possibly even refutes, established tradition? Certainly official interpretation assured that they did not. There is, of course, nothing to suggest any deliberate or systematic falsification of evidence on the part of the international team. But for Father de Vaux, his most intensely personal convictions were deeply engaged and were bound to have exerted some influence. The key factor in determining the significance of the scrolls and their relation or lack of it to Christianity consisted, of course, in their dating. Were they pre- or post-Christian? How closely did they coincide with Jesus' activities around AD 30, with the travels and letters of Paul, roughly between AD 40 and 65, with the composition of the Gospels between AD 70 and 95? Whatever the date ascribed to them, they might be a source of possible embarrassment to Christendom, but the degree of embarrassment would be variable. If, for example, the scrolls could be dated from well before the Christian era, they might threaten to compromise Jesus' originality and uniqueness, might show some of his words and concepts to have been not wholly his own, but to have been derived from a current of thought, teaching and tradition already established and in the air. If the scrolls dated from Jesus' lifetime, however, or from shortly thereafter, they might prove more embarrassing still. They might be used to argue that the teacher of righteousness who figures in them was Jesus himself, and that Jesus was not therefore perceived as divine by his contemporaries. Moreover, the scrolls contained or implied certain premises inimical to subsequent images of early Christianity. There were, for example, statements of a militant messianic nationalism associated previously only with the zealots, when Jesus was supposed to be non-political, rendering unto Caesar what was Caesar's. It might even emerge that Jesus had never dreamed of founding a new religion or of contravening Judaic law. The evidence can be interpreted in a number of plausible ways, some of which are less compromising to Christendom than others. It is hardly surprising in the circumstances that de Vaux should have inclined towards and promulgated the less compromising interpretations, and so forth. Well, we've spent a lot of time on the Dead Sea Scrolls, as so far we've found that they were suppressed, as we had already read. Someone had a monopoly on them. A team working on them led by a certain Father de Vaux, etc., and a Milik, and definitely suggests that the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, had a stranglehold, a monopoly also, and didn't want those released. They wanted them suppressed. They didn't want them to be released to the public. So if you like this video so far, subscribe to our channel and give us a like, add your comments down below, and tell everyone about the Dead Sea Scrolls video here. And wow, what amazing information and has come to light, especially about the Roman Catholic Church and the monopoly on ancient scriptures, ancient texts found meant to be released to the public so they'll know the real truth.